Trauma Stabilisation Model: How Societies Rebuild Political Order. After collective trauma, political order is rarely born from calm. More often, political order emerges after rupture: war, revolution, occupation, partition, imperial collapse, civil conflict, institutional breakdown, systemic crisis. After such events, societies do not only need new institutions. They need a new way to understand what happened. They need to reinterpret the past. They need to rebuild collective identity. They need to restore legitimacy. They need to create meaning after disruption. This is the problem addressed by the Trauma Stabilisation Model, or TSM. TSM is a PII framework for understanding how societies transform collective trauma into symbolic systems that help reconstruct political order. The central insight is simple. A society cannot rebuild political order only through administration, law, force, or institutional design. It also needs symbolic stabilization. It needs narratives. It needs memory. It needs rituals. It needs public meaning. It needs shared interpretations of suffering, survival, injustice, sacrifice, and renewal. Without these symbolic structures, institutions may exist formally, but they may not feel legitimate. A constitution may be written, a border may be drawn, a government may be formed, a legal system may operate, but the political community may still remain disoriented. TSN begins with collective trauma. Collective trauma is not simply an event. It is the way a society interprets an event as a rupture in its historic identity. A war may destroy infrastructure, but collective trauma occurs when the society experiences the war as a wound in its memory and meaning. A revolution may replace a regime, but collective trauma occurs when the political community no longer knows how to understand its own past. An occupation, genocide, civil war, partition, or collapse may damage not only institutions, but the symbolic order that held society together. This is why TSM matters. It asks, how do societies reconstruct meaning after the collapse of political and symbolic coherence? The model identifies a core sequence: collective trauma, symbol formation, meaning stabilization, institutional embedding. First, collective trauma creates disruption. The old narratives no longer explain the present. The old identities no longer feel secure. The old institutions may no longer command trust. The old political language may no longer carry authority. A society enters an interpretive crisis. It must ask, who are we now? What happened to us? Who is responsible? What must never happen again? What must be rebuilt? What political order can now be justified? Second, symbol formation begins. After trauma, societies create symbols to make the rupture intelligible. A memorial, a flag, a ruined city, a battlefield, a day of remembrance, a founding document, a liberation story, a narrative of sacrifice, a narrative of betrayal, a narrative of resistance, a narrative of renewal. Symbols condense trauma into forms that can be shared. They allow a society to say, this is what happened, this is what it meant, this is what we endured, this is what we must remember. But symbol formation is never neutral. Different groups may struggle over the meaning of the same traumatic event. One group may call it liberation, another may call it catastrophe, one may call it sacrifice, another may call it betrayal. One may frame trauma as a warning against tyranny, another may frame it as a reason for permanent mobilization. This is why TSM treats symbol formation as a political process. Whoever shapes the symbols of trauma helps shape the future political order. Third, meaning stabilization occurs. A symbol alone is not yet a stable political order. For symbols to stabilize society, their meanings must become widely accepted. They must enter public memory. They must become part of education, culture, ceremony, political language, and civic identity. Over time, a traumatic event may become a foundational narrative. A society may come to understand itself through a story of resistance or survival,
or injustice, or liberation, or national rebirth, or never again. These narratives do not merely describe the past. They shape the present. They define who belongs. They define what institutions are for. They define what threats matter. They define what sacrifices are honored. They define what political actions appear legitimate. In this stage, trauma becomes political meaning, and political meaning becomes a stabilizing force. Fourth, institutional embedding takes place. Once trauma has been transformed into symbols and stabilized into meaning, it often enters institutions.
It enters constitutions. It enters legal systems. It enters school curricula. It enters public commemorations. It enters national holidays. It enters military ceremonies. It enters monuments. It enters foreign policy. It enters citizenship narratives. It enters the language of legitimacy itself. At this point, trauma is no longer only remembered. It is institutionalized. It becomes part of the architecture of political order. This is the central claim of TSM. Political orders are often reconstructed by transforming collective trauma into symbolic systems that stabilize identity, legitimacy, and institutions. But TSM is not a simple celebration of stabilization. Stabilization can heal, but it can also freeze the wound. It can create coherence, but it can also suppress alternative memory. It can restore legitimacy, but it can also justify exclusion. It can protect society from repetition, but it can also trap society inside the trauma it is trying to overcome. This is why the model distinguishes between different stabilization pathways. Some societies move toward democratic stabilization. Trauma becomes a reason to protect rights, limit power, preserve pluralism, and prevent recurrence. Some societies move toward authoritarian stabilization. Trauma becomes a reason to centralize authority, suppress dissent, and define opposition as danger. Some societies move toward territorial stabilization. Trauma becomes attached to borders, homeland, sovereignty, and territorial defense. Some societies move toward ideological stabilization. Trauma becomes attached to borders, homeland, sovereignty, and territorial defense. Some societies move toward ideological stabilization. Trauma becomes attached to borders, homeland, sovereignty, and territorial defense. Some societies move toward ideological stabilization. Trauma becomes attached to borders, homeland, sovereignty, and territorial defense. Some societies move toward ideological stabilization. Trauma becomes attached to borders, homeland, sovereignty, and territorial defense. Some societies move toward ideological stabilization. Trauma becomes proof of a political doctrine, a revolutionary mission, or a civilizational struggle. Some societies move toward cultural or civilizational stabilization. Trauma becomes part of a long memory of identity, destiny, decline, restoration, or survival. TSM does not assume that one path must follow trauma. It asks which path is forming, and it asks whether that path is reconstructing political order or reproducing unresolved trauma through political order. This is where TSM connects to the wider PII political order model. PII also uses TTL, the Trauma Territory Law Framework. TTL studies how trauma becomes attached to territory and how territory becomes codified through law. TSM studies a complementary process. It asks how trauma becomes symbol, meaning, identity, and institutional legitimacy. Together, TSM and TTL form a broader theory of political reconstruction. TSM explains symbolic stabilization. TTL explains territorial and legal stabilization. One stabilizes meaning. The other stabilizes structure. One asks how trauma becomes narrative and identity. The other asks how trauma becomes border, sovereignty, and law. Together they show that political order is not built from institutions alone. It is built from memory, territory, law, symbolism, legitimacy, and historical interpretation.
This matters deeply in the 21st century. Many conflicts today are not only material conflicts, they are memory conflicts. Many territorial disputes are not only about land, they are about trauma attached to land. Many legal orders are not only administrative systems, they are attempts to stabilize historical rupture. Many political movements are not only ideological projects, they are attempts to reinterpret collective injury. Many states are not only governing populations, they are governing wounds. TSM gives us a way to analyze these processes without reducing them to emotion, propaganda, or irrationality. Collective trauma is real, memory is real, loss is real, a statical injury is real, the need for symbolic repair is real. But TSM also warns that trauma must not be allowed to govern without reflection. A society must ask, what trauma is being remembered? What symbols are carrying it? What meanings have become dominant? Whose memory has been excluded? Which institutions now reproduce the trauma narrative? Does the narrative stabilize legitimacy, or does it preserve fear? Does it create repair, or does it justify permanent emergency? Does it allow political order to mature, or does it trap the future inside the wound? This is the diagnostic power of the Trauma Stabilisation Model. It allows PII to examine political order not only as a system of power, law, and territory, but as a system of symbolic reconstruction after trauma. The model shows that after rupture, society seeks stability, but stability is not always the same as healing. A stable order may still be trauma-coded. A functioning institution may still be built around unresolved fear. A legal system may still preserve an old wound. A national narrative may still prevent honest repair.
TSM, therefore, asks the decisive question: has collective trauma been transformed into a legitimate foundation for renewed political order, or has it been stabilized as a permanent operating system? That question is essential for understanding post-war societies, revolutionary states, post-imperial transitions, fragmented states, populist movements, migration conflicts, geopolitical blocs, and global trauma narratives. The core PII insight is this: political order is not only constructed through power, it is constructed through the stabilization of meaning after collective trauma. When that stabilization is hit as plural, lawful, and open to repair, it can support reconstruction. When it is closed, authoritarian, exclusionary, or mythologized, it can reproduce trauma across generations. That is the purpose of TSM. To reveal the hidden symbolic architecture through which societies rebuild order after rupture, to distinguish reconstruction from repetition, to distinguish memory from imprisonment, to distinguish stabilization from healing, and to ask whether political order has truly been reconstructed, or whether the wound is simply learned to govern. PII, a discipline, not a trend, a framework, not an opinion. Frameworks turn complexity into admissible decisions.